I was born Joran Threnn. I want that said once, at the start, because after tonight, it will not be said again. The cognators do not record birth names. They record designations. Mine, if you check the manifest of the 6th Ferrum cohort, reads Skitarii Ranger Alpha Threnn-9, Maniple Row. That is what I have been for 41 years. That is what I will die as tomorrow, on the ash flats outside the Vareth Gate. But I was born Joran Threnn, on Kaldrek Prime, in the underhab levels beneath the number 9 forge complex, where the sky is a lid of soot, and the only light most children ever see comes off the arc furnace flare, bleeding orange through a kilometer of smog. You did not see stars on Kaldrek. You saw the glow of the forges, and you learned that glow was the closest thing to a god's face you would ever be shown. My mother worked the slag lines. My father worked the slag lines until the slag lines took his left arm and half his hearing. And then he worked them anyway, because a forge world does not stop for a man's ruin. It simply reassigns him lighter duty and lets the cogitators note the loss of efficiency. I remember the sound he made when the Medici adepts fitted the augmetic stump. Not a scream, a grunt. On Kaldrek, you learn early that screaming wastes air the recyclers have to filter twice. By the time I was 6, I could name every caste of servitor that passed through our hab stack. By 8, I had seen my first execution, a foreman who falsified an output quota, dragged before a Skitarii detachment, and disintegrated by a single plasma round, clean, economical, over in a second. Nobody wept. My mother told me that night, the machine does not forgive waste, and neither should you. That was the whole of the catechism I was raised on. Waste is the only true sin. Flesh is inefficient, temporary, and therefore lesser. The Omnissiah does not care how you feel about your suffering. He cares whether your suffering produces output. I did not choose the Skitarii. On Kaldrek, you do not choose. At 12, I was tested. Reflex, pain tolerance, cortical resilience, and at 13 I was taken from the underhab and marched to the Adeptus Mechanicus induction spire, and that was the last day I was only a boy. They do not ease you into it. The first augmetic they gave me was the reinforced ocular, a crude thing back then that replaced my left eye with a red glass lens and a targeting filament threaded through the optic nerve. I remember the smell most. Hot, flux metal and my own burning tissue, and underneath it, incense, because the tech priests chant the litany of the flesh made better while they cut you, and you are meant to find that comforting. I did not find it comforting. I found it necessary. There is a difference, and on Kaldrek you learn to stop looking for the first one. My training cohort had 11 initiates. 4 survived augmentation intact. That is not unusual. That is simply the price of the process, and nobody apologized for it, because apology implies the outcome was wrong, and the outcome was, by the doctrine of my world, correct. The man who oversaw our conversion was Tech Priest Dominus Varkal Essenmorn, fabricator locum of the number 9 forge. I will speak of him more than once tonight, because he shaped me more than my own father did, in the way a hammer shapes a blade rather than a father shapes a son. Essenmorn had replaced so much of himself that only his voice remained recognizably human, and even that had a vocal modulator laced through it, so every sentence he spoke carried a faint metallic undertone, like a man talking through a grate. He told us, the day we became rangers in truth, standing in our new galvanic carapace with our bonding rights barely healed, you were flesh. Flesh fails. You are now instrument. Instruments do not fail. They are only used until they are used up. Rejoice, you have been elevated past the tragedy of being merely human. I did not feel elevated. I felt hollowed. But I learned over the following years that the hollowness was useful. It let you do what needed doing. I was assigned to the 6th Ferrum cohort, Ranger Maniple Row, under Ranger Alpha Drask. The man whose rank I now hold, and whose ash, what little of him could be recovered, I helped scatter into the forge intake myself. Drask was old for a Skitarii. 60-some years of continuous field service, so heavily augmented that I never once saw his original face, only a fixed grey mask plate with a single working eye. He did not talk much. When he did, it mattered. There were 5 of us in the maniple I came to think of, in whatever part of me still thought in those terms as something like a family. Kessa Voss, our long-last specialist, who had a habit of tapping 2 fingers against her rifle stock before every shot. An old superstition she never explained and I never asked about, because superstition was not something we discussed aloud. Bael Urin, the youngest of us, barely out of induction, still flinching at the recoil of his own weapon in a way the older rangers had long since had trained out of them. Ismay Kaur, our arc-tech specialist, who could coax function out of a weapon system 3 tech priests had already condemned as scrap, and who talked to the machine spirits of our gear like they were old friends doing her a favor. And Ro, that was the name we used for him, though it was properly his maniple designator, a vanguard pattern Skitarii, quadruped-legged, radium carbine mounted, who communicated mostly in binaric clicks that Ismay translated for the rest of us, and who I trusted with my back more than I trusted my own reflexes. Drask commanded us. Essenmorn, above him, commanded the Forge's war effort entire. My first true deployment was to the Ashreich salient, putting down an uprising in an outlying mine settlement that had stopped meeting its quota and started listening to a preacher who claimed the machine god was a lie built to enslave men. We were not sent to negotiate. I remember the mine tunnels, the wet metal smell, the way sound carried strange down there, how a man's voice could sound like it was coming from 3 directions at once. I remember killing my first human being in that tunnel, a settler with a stub pistol and no augmetics at all, and how easy it was, and how the ease of it frightened me more than the killing itself. My targeting filament painted him red before my conscious mind had finished registering he was a threat. My hand fired before I decided to fire. That is what they build into you. That is what instrument means. Drask found me afterward, staring at my own hands under the tunnel emergency lighting. He said only, "The doubt fades. What replaces it does not." I did not understand him then. I understand him now, and some nights I wish I still didn't. The real war came 4 years later, when the Greenskins found Kaldrek Prime. An Ork Waaaghs does not arrive like an invasion. It arrives like weather. First, the void scanners caught the debris trail, hundreds of scrap-hulled vessels, crude and enormous, converging on our system with the single-minded joy of a species that treats war as recreation. Then they were in the sky, then they were on the ground, and the character of the fighting changed entirely. Where the cultists in the tunnels had been quiet and desperate, the orcs were loud and gleeful. They laughed while they died. They laughed while they killed us. I had never fought an enemy that enjoyed it before, and there is something uniquely draining about killing something that finds the entire exercise delightful. The Forge World's answer to invasion is not valor. It is arithmetic. Essenmorn's war room ran the campaign like a production line. Acceptable loss ratios per hectare defended, ammunition rationing measured in exact grains of promethium and radium charge, replacement Skitarii pulled from the induction spires faster than the tech priests could properly bond the augmetics. I saw a 13-year-old sent to the line with augmentation barely 3 weeks healed. Nobody called this cruelty. It was called necessity. And on Kaldrek those words had long since become synonyms. We lost Bael in the 2nd month of the siege, at the collapse of the 9th Manufactorum perimeter. An orc knob crushed his skull plate with an improvised power claw before Ro put 4 radium rounds through the thing's chest. Bael's last sound was not a scream. It was a short, surprised grunt, cut off mid-breath, the same sound my father made when they took his arm. I have thought of that a great deal since. How the sound of loss on Kaldrek Prime is always the same small sound, no matter what is lost. We lost Kessa 3 weeks after that, in the retaking of the Arc Furnace district, when an Ork rocket took her position apart before she'd finished her habitual two-fingered tap against the rifle stock. I found the rifle intact in the rubble. I did not find enough of her to require the intake ceremony. Ismay recorded her name into the Manipul's memorial cogitator herself. Her hands, I noticed, unsteady in a way I had never seen from her before. The horror came at the height of the siege, when a company of cultists, human but corrupted, marked with symbols that made my augmetic eye ache to look at directly, infiltrated the lower forge levels and attempted a working. I do not have proper words for what a warp incursion looks like from the inside. I can tell you what it did. It got into the machine spirits. Servitors that had processed ore for decades began moving without instruction, their optic sensors weeping black fluid, their vox boxes producing sounds no cogitator language should produce. An entire maintenance cohort, men and women I had eaten ration paste beside for years, turned on their overseers with tools instead of weapons, screaming in a language that hurt to hear because the machine god's works had been touched by something that was the machine god's opposite in every possible way. Drask gave the order himself. Full purge. Everyone in the lower levels, converted or not, still human or already lost. No exceptions. No verification, because there was no time to verify, and the alternative was letting the corruption spread into the Forge's primary cogitation core. I helped execute that order. I will not describe what that required in detail, because some things are not owed to an audience, even a memorial archive. I will say only that I recognized 2 of the faces before I fired, and that recognizing them did not stop my hand, and that this frightened me more than anything the Orks had done, because it meant Essenmorn had been right about me. I had become instrument completely. The doubt had faded. What replaced it did not. Ro lost half his lower chassis in that same purge, dragging Ismay clear of a structural collapse. He survived. He was never fully whole again. He still fights. He simply fights on 3 legs instead of 4, and clicks a little slower than he used to, and none of us ever mention it, because on Kaldrek, mentioning a wound is itself a kind of waste. 2 months later, word came down through the astropathic relay that Praxis Kell, a Forge world 11 systems distant, one whose output we had depended on for void shield components, had fallen entirely, not damaged, not besieged, fallen. Its fabricator general dead, its manufactorum cores lost or corrupted beyond recovery, its population either dead, enslaved, or worse. I want to describe what that did to me honestly. It was not grief, not exactly. I had never set foot on Praxis Kell, knew no one there. It was something closer to vertigo. My entire life had been built on a single unspoken assumption, that the Forge worlds were permanent, that the machine god's works were, whatever else might be said of them, enduring. Praxis Kell proved that assumption a lie. If a Forge world could fall entirely, then Kaldrek could fall entirely. Then I could spend my whole existence as an instrument in service of something that was, in the end, just as breakable as the flesh it had replaced in me. I said something like this to Drask, in the exhausted quiet after a shift, in words I am not proud of. I said, "What is the point of any of it, if it can all just be unmade?" Drask was quiet a long time before he answered. When he did, his voice through the mask plate's modulator was as close to gentle as I ever heard it. "You think the Omnissiah's purpose was ever the Forge itself? The Forge is stone and steel. It was always going to break eventually. Everything does. That is the first lesson they cut into you. The purpose was never the building. It was the pattern, the knowledge. What we make, what we learn, what we pass on before we are used up. Praxis Kell's forges are gone. Praxis Kell's data hordes were transmitted out 3 days before the fall. The pattern survives. That is what does not break. That is what you serve, not the walls, the continuance. I did not feel comforted, but I felt, for the first time since the purge, that there was still a reason to hold the line, and sometimes a reason is enough even when comfort is not available. Drask died the following spring in a counter-assault I will not describe in full because it was fast and ugly and there is nothing instructive in the details, only the fact of it. He bought 4 seconds for the rest of the maniple to fall back, and 4 seconds was exactly what 4 seconds needed to be. I was given his rank the same week. There was no ceremony. Essen Morn simply updated the cohort manifest and told me, in that grated, half-mechanical voice, "Continuance requires someone to hold the pattern. Hold it." That was 19 years ago. I train the initiates now, the ones pulled fresh from the induction spires, hands still shaking from augmentation, eyes not yet used to seeing the world through a targeting filament. Half of them are not even native to Kaldrek anymore, refugee stock pulled in from 3 different collapsed settlements the Forge absorbed over 2 decades of attrition warfare. I do not teach them Kaldrek's old underhab songs or its particular dialect of grief. Those belong to a world that, if I am honest with myself, has already changed past the point of recognizing what raised me. What I teach them is the pattern, the discipline, the doctrine that flesh fails and instrument endures and waste is the only true sin, and the machine. God's purpose is carried in continuance, not in any single wall or any single body, mine included. Ismay still serves beside me, more augmetic now than woman, though she still talks to the machine spirits like old friends doing her a favor. Rose still walks on 3 legs and clicks a little slower, and neither of us has ever once mentioned it aloud. Tomorrow, the Vareth gate falls or holds, and either way I am marching out to it, because a new incursion has been detected moving through the ash flats, and the cohort is short-staffed, and I am, whatever else I have become across 41 years, still an instrument, and instruments do not retire. They are used until they are used up. I do not know if I return from the Vareth line. I find, examining myself honestly one last time before I go, that I am no longer frightened by that uncertainty the way the boy in the mine tunnel was frightened by his own hands. The doubt faded a long time ago. What replaced it is this: I am not the wall. I was never the wall. I am the pattern carried forward one more day, one more line, one more initiate, taught to hold a rifle steady. The forges of Kaldrek may fall someday, the way Praxis Kel's forges fell. I have made my peace with that. Stone breaks, steel breaks, flesh certainly breaks, mine most of all, and soon. But the pattern does not break. The pattern is carried hand to hand, rank to rank, until there is no one left standing to carry it, and even then someone always is. I go to the gate now. The cog does not stop turning.